Chaos, starring Neurotoxin and Joe Ryan. Edge of Chaos is a free-flowing discussion occasionally dealing with mature topics.
Alright everybody, welcome back to the Edge of Chaos. I am Joe Ryan here with Neurotoxin.
Hello.
And today we wanted to discuss the immigration crisis, the immigration problem, I guess, if you was to listen to a Fox News person describe it. But I want to have Toxin introduce our guest for today.
All right, so welcome everybody. I'm Neurotoxin, and of course today we're going to be discussing what I'm calling the perfect storm. I think the only thing it's a crisis for is the establishment of both major parties. I'm just going to go out there on a limb and say that right now. And to me, of course, that makes me ecstatic because both party establishments have got to go. But before I jump ahead of myself, we are proud to welcome today my good friend Jonathan Francis. At least that's what he'll be going by on the show. Jonathan grew up in Honduras, one of the countries in question, clearly. He immigrated here when he was 10 years old. He lived in Los Angeles for most of his life as a naturalized citizen. He served in the armed forces in the U.S. Navy, did 2 tours before going to school with me. Also has a degree in political science and international relations. So he'll be helping us understand Central America, Honduras in particular, and the experiences of Honduran immigrants here in the U.S., and also just the whole international relations situation. So why don't you introduce yourself, Jonathan?
Hello, I'm Jonathan Francis, and thank you for having me here.
Thank you. Welcome to the show.
Happy to have you on the show. So I thought we would start today by picking Jonathan's brain a little bit for his experiences in his childhood and in his adolescence here in California. We're going to do pretty much the same format that has worked very well for us with our previous couple of guests. We'll ask him we'll have him kind of share experiences he wants to share and then ask some questions. And our listeners are welcome to post more questions for Jonathan if they would like on our website or on our Facebook presence. Jonathan is absolutely accessible to us. We'd love to answer your questions. So with that, take it away, Jonathan. Tell us about your life. Tell us about your experiences.
Sure. My experiences in Honduras as a kid, they were of a maybe middle-class family in Honduras. And I remember going to a private school in Honduras. I was going to private schools because in Honduras, people, if you're middle class, you don't want to send your kids to a public school. Everybody knows that around there. So I just, growing up in a private school, I started learning a lot. And they even teach you how to speak English because in general, Hondurans, they know how important it was back then. And in late 70s, early 80s to start learning English. Hondurans in general, they like everything that's Americanized. And basically, I started learning English back then as a kid. Those were my experiences growing up. And I also remember seeing poverty. Poverty was always everywhere. But there was a lot of business. There was a lot of business thriving back then. The banana plantains, I remember all that. And that's when my mom migrated to Honduras back in the 70s, and we came here legally.
From Honduras?
From
Jonathan,
Honduras.
From Honduras, okay.
And we flew. We flew on a plane. We never thought, like, people that came to the United States from Honduras, they never in their mind, it crossed in their minds that they were gonna be taking a train
or a tunnel.
From a train or a tunnel, or hire a coyote, no one knew that back then.
Right.
And
so
that's something you had to do.
Clarify very quickly. So in your experience, late 70s, early 80s, I mean, this is a good 30, 35 years ago now.
Mm-hmm.
There was not a lot of illegal immigration, undocumented migration from Honduras or from Central America at that time. I mean, there were immigrants, but they were legal. They came over this way, the way you're describing.
And they flew, and most of them flew from Honduras to Florida and New Orleans and all those areas around there. They never thought about coming to LA. It was too far away. Okay. Anyways, so. Okay.
So how did you land in Los Angeles? If most of them were on the East Coast.
Yeah, we just flew. We flew from the capital of Honduras, Tegucigalpa, and we landed in LA.
Okay, but my question is, why did your family choose Los Angeles?
Oh, because it was just something with my mom. She wanted to come to LA. That's it.
Okay.
She was maybe fascinated by it
Wow.
back then.
Hollywood.
I guess back then there was something to be fascinated by in Los Angeles. Wow.
Hollywood.
Hollywood, Hollywood.
And I believe
that's what brings a lot of people to LA still.
And then aren't they shocked? So
Then there's a culture shock for sure.
yeah.
Wait, LA isn't all Hollywood? There's other areas?
Well, just like New Orleans isn't all the French Quarter, New
Oh,
York
well,
isn't all
I can
Times
tell you that
Square,
from experience,
Las
too.
Vegas is not all the Strip, and so forth. In any case, so why don't you tell us a little bit about your experiences here once you're living in Los Angeles? I mean, you came over. How old were you? Start with that.
I was 10 years old, 10 years old, around there.
Okay.
Basically, I started going to school here, and I started going to the public school systems here, and I didn't understand none of that. I knew how important school was, though, for sure, and I knew what I had to do to succeed. I knew I had to get good grades and all that. I mean, that's how my parents taught me to be. And there was in this public school systems here, I noticed there was the ones I went to, and it was a big Mexican community. It was like 95% Mexican.
Okay.
And the schools, so they had a different lingo, the different way they spoke. It was kind of like a Chicano slang, Spanglish.
Okay.
Yeah.
So most of this Mexican community was U.S. born, or were they immigrants? And if they were immigrants, were they mostly legal or
When
mostly
I
undocumented?
first came here, it seemed that most of them were born here.
Okay.
And but then I also noticed that there started to become a big migration of immigrants from Mexico coming to all those areas. So a lot of them were and Mexico is so big that every region in Mexico is different, and they have different ways they speak also. And so I was submerged in that kind of atmosphere.
Okay. So a lot of them were coming basically to join their families, is what you noticed.
Yeah.
And
even when I spoke my language, they knew I was foreign. And they knew, like, what? Your Spanish is different.
right. Well, but it is different. You know, Honduras and Guatemala, El Salvador, those countries are very different from Mexico, especially most places in Mexico that we have migrants from in the U.S. are in the north of Mexico.
Yeah.
So that's a long ways away.
Yeah, then it took a little while for me to start getting used to the Mexican culture here in LA. But when I came here, I came with the expectation that everything was going to be just like what I used to see on TV back at home in Honduras. I thought it was
I'm sorry.
It was like, what happened to the little house of Prairie? Where are all those people at?
Well, that show was set in the 1850s.
I know, but I'm talking about like culture-wise, American culture, though.
I'm assuming that
American culture.
I'm assuming that a lot of people of all colors just assumed you were Mexican, didn't they? Just so they didn't know you, right?
Well,
if you just met someone, they would just go, "Oh, what part are you from?" or something like that, right?
Yeah, like the funny thing was that I don't know if that's still happening now, but back then, if I said I was if I said I was from Honduras, they would ask me, what part of Mexico is that?
Is that? Yeah, what state is that? Yeah,
that's the biggest thing right there.
And see, that's just...
Is that in Mexican? What is that? Is that near Oaxaca? Where is that?
See, that's just embarrassing.
Right, I know.
No, but really, from a political standpoint, we're trying to come down on this immigration crisis and people coming in, and we have probably still a good 50-60% of our population that don't realize those countries are not Mexico.
Right.
How can you possibly have a reasonable discussion with someone that does not understand that Honduras is not Mexico? And it's not. And just based on what you're saying, I mean, the importance of learning English and the class stratification and the economy there, everything in that country is very different from Mexico, from what I understand. Probably of the three, it's the most different from Mexico. Am I right, Jonathan?
Nah, you're right.
Okay, so let me ask you and pick your brain a little bit more. So when Joe says that people assumed you were Mexican, obviously the people from Mexico didn't really assume you were Mexican. They identified you as someone that's from a different Spanish-speaking country. Am I right?
Well, yeah. Basically, there was the Chicanos. They don't even know that much about Mexico either. I noticed that, and They were just very different. They just didn't have. They to me they didn't seem to have. They don't have an identity. I think they just thought they were Americans and that's it.
So you're talking about like Mexican folks that grew up in Los Angeles,
That were
in Los
born
Angeles,
or grew up here also,
or came here very, very young. Okay,
yeah,
so
and they had the Mexican Chicano lingo, which like they sometimes when they spoke English, they threw in Spanish phrases or words in it, and their lingo and their slang, and that to me was like, whoa, that's kind of interesting.
Okay, and we're talking about, tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of people in Los Angeles that are in this culture, that are in these communities. Los Angeles is a very big city. So this is important. This is an important part of the population that really isn't Mexican by any stretch of the imagination. They either were born here or left Mexico when they were very young. So even if they're undocumented, this is where they identify as Los Angeles. They're Angelinos.
Well, the thing that when I first came here to the States, I wanted to learn English. I was 9-10 years old. I wanted to learn English really fast, and I heard people told me it's gonna take you about 2 years to learn it, and then it was already 2.5 years, and I was frustrated because how come I'm not learning it? You know what I'm saying?
It's because English is screwed up.
Well, that and you're learning right, but you're also learning the Spanglish.
Everybody around in LA was speaking Spanish.
Or
right.
Spanglish.
Yeah, not to mention, right.
More
everybody.
accurately.
Messes with your immersion.
Yes, I was kind of pissed off about that.
I actually have sympathy for everyone who isn't a native English speaker having to learn it, because it's like, the rules don't make sense to native English speakers.
Right, but the thing
anyway,
is, that's the same with me
point,
and Jonathan. Right, we both came over as children, so it's really a lot easier to pick up. English is actually a relatively easy language to pick up. It's difficult to learn from a book, but
yeah, I've heard that though. Being immersed in any language, you have to figure it out. It's it's ingrained.
And then I understood why a lot of parents, Mexican parents, I saw a lot of parents straight from Mexico, first generations, they were not teaching their kids Spanish. They were just, don't learn Spanish at home, just go to school and just talk English. So all those kids growing up in school, they were not learning Spanish either, So, and they were having conflicts because they look different than the typical American. They didn't look white. They look brown, dark complected. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So moving a little bit forward, and kind of your experience as a teenager, obviously in the 90s. So you're talking about late 80s, early 90s. You're talking about an increase in migrants, first generation migrants, more people coming to join their families, more children in schools that are actually from Mexico as opposed to having grown up here, even though their origins are in Mexico.
Yeah, well, what I saw here in LA also was that there was already like second generation Guatemalans. Yeah, they were from they were refugees, and I used to ask them, how come your English is so good? Because I came here a long time ago. I was born here, and they would ask me,
Okay, so it sounds like there's kind of a parallel wave of Central American migration that's going on, but a lot of it is similar to you. It's more middle class migration. They're not coming in, in large families and droves to join their families. They're more coming the way you are, and they may land in these communities that are predominantly Mexican, but they sounds like they stand out. Sounds like your values are a little different. They're much more. You're much more wanting to learn solid English, proper English, as opposed to the Spanglish that's spoken in these countries or in these communities. So it sounds like there's a distinct difference there from what you're describing to me. Okay. So anything else you want to tell us about your personal experiences before we kind of move into more political discussion?
No, that's about it.
Joe, do you have any more questions for Jonathan?
I mean, I assume that. I guess my only questions were actually concerned with just the biases that maybe people have to deal with as being a recent American, I guess you could call it, right? I guess I was curious to see what, because actually my father's a naturalized citizen too, so it's like it's the same sort of thing, only he was from England, so that's different. You stick out, but you speak English, so it's like quite a different experience. But I guess my one thing is similar to you, Toxin. Was there a community of other Hondurans where you lived, even amongst all the people from Mexico and whatnot, where you kind of had a network of support for each other, kind of assimilating? And if anyone had questions or something like that, was there kind of a community there? underlying the other bigger community? Because I know, like, with Russians, like, they tend to stick with each other and help each other out and stuff like that. Is there? I guess that's with every group, probably, right? Or at least, was that true in yours?
I didn't see that support because there wasn't that many Hondurans in LA.
Okay.
Yeah, there wasn't. I mean, that's why. Well, the way I feel growing up as a kid here was that I had to learn but just naturally I learned the costumes of the Mexican culture here, and the Mexican American also, like the foods, eating the hot spicy foods and all that. Because in Honduras you don't eat hot spicy foods.
Actually, I guess the
Just like
irony
in
is,
Spain.
the irony is, like, a person who's American and living in LA would just assume that you were Mexican just out of hand, and it's like, in a way, you were sort of forced to adapt some of those characteristics just to fit in. That's kind of, I don't know what that is, if that's irony or what.
The support that we got here was from other races, and especially in LA, there was already a large other groups of races, and that's the support I feel we got.
Let me ask you a different question, actually, a follow-up question on that. What about relations between various Central American groups? And obviously we have today in focus, we have Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, but also like Nicaragua, Costa Rica, those countries. Did you encounter other communities like other Central Americans? And if you did, how do you guys really relate to each other? Are those countries necessarily, does everyone get along, or is there kind of rivalries between those countries as well?
Well, in the beginning, I've noticed that people got along. Like in the beginning, like back as growing up here, I noticed a lot of Latin Americans. They were getting along. They all got along. The Hondurans and the Colombians and Hondurans and Mexicans. We got along just fine. I think what happened was once there's an overpopulation of those a specific group of people, then that's when there's hostility and competition.
So yeah, one thing that really aggravates me, because I do have some experience with Central American communities, and I know a lot about Central America just from my education, as do you. And one thing that really aggravates me, especially about the Fox News types and kind of the neocon social media, and Joe's rolling his eyes about how much he loves that contingent of our society, but I mean, we all love them. But one thing that really aggravates me is this marginalization of basically 3, 4, 5 entire countries with absolutely the worst elements of their population. And we've all heard of the Mara Salvatrucha and some of the just the notorious Central American gangs, and a lot of them are now becoming the coyotes of those countries. Before you even get to Mexico, you have to pay one of them to get you to Mexico, and they're involved with a lot of the smuggling and the drugs and just the terrible things going on in those countries. But, I mean, they're there, and they're a problem. I'm not defending them, and they're actually very active in Los Angeles and some parts of the United States where these communities are. But I guess what I'm trying to get out of you is just, how do you feel about that? That, I mean, I'm sure it's less so with Honduras than countries like El Salvador or Nicaragua or Guatemala, but still, just Central Americans become marginalized, even far more so than, say, Mexican immigrants, with these gangs and these criminal elements.
I don't know. Maybe it's because they find a weakness in a country. They say that country's poor and weak, so let's just take advantage of them.
You mean the criminals and the gangs will do that?
That and the people also that are marginalizing it.
Right. So they kind of become convenient for the propaganda machine to abuse. Okay, look, well, there's some asshole that's done 2 stints in prison, and he's got Mara Salvatrucha tattoos all over him. Let's take pictures of him and then post them up on Facebook and say this is what all El Salvadorans look like. Although most El Salvadorans are terrified of that gang.
I thought the most interesting movie ever made about the plight of not middle class like you, Jonathan, but the more poor Central American immigrants was El Norte. I don't know if you ever saw that movie.
I've
seen it.
Very good movie, I think. I thought, like, as far as like it supposedly it offered like a pretty realistic, at least for that economic class. But
is that the one about a Honduran guy that
Guatemalan
waits in a train?
Guatemalan? Yeah, one of them actually crawls through a tube full of rats, I think, to get to America at one point. But there's a few different groups, I think, in the movie.
Jonathan, there's a documentary also by that name. It's actually called The Journey Toward El Norte, and it actually has some elements in common, but that's not what Joe's talking about.
Yeah, it's a movie. Yeah.
Okay.
I actually met that director on a plane once, but yeah, anyway.
Oh, nice.
Great movie. Great director.
Well, one thing that I heard about when I was a kid in Honduras was that the very poor people, the way they would take their vacations is they would save a little bit of money and ride those trains to Mexico because they thought Mexico was also cool, because they're used to seeing Mexican TV and all that,
Okay.
Right.
That makes sense.
They would do that, but they would never try to cross to the United States. Once they realized that they couldn't, they would come back. Once they would run out of money, they would go back.
Pretty far away. I mean, Mexico's right there.
It's extremely, yeah.
Okay. So what I'd like to do next, thank you, Jonathan, and definitely, of course, we're going to still have you with us. I'd like to fill in a few blanks for our listeners because, like I said, this is one of my areas of specialty is Central American studies and Central American relations. And I know it's a little dry here and there, but I kind of want to fill in some of the historical blanks in our relationships with those countries and where those countries came from because as we're learning from interviewing Jonathan, there's really a lot of pieces missing. There's a lot of information missing. And when you have widespread ignorance, I don't really have a problem with people not knowing. My problem is the Fox News of the world will fill it in for you. And they'll fill it in.
Gloss over it like it's not important. Yeah.
Right. But the thing is, when
mostly because it's inconvenient to their point, usually.
Yes, and they'll say things that kind of encourage you and lead you to fill in with information that's just plain wrong. Yeah. A lot of times it's racist to boot, like taking pictures of Mara Salvatrucha members and hoping you just presume they're all El Salvadorans are like that. I mean, that's xenophobia in a nutshell, right?
Which
there.
is as old as America, really.
It's as old as time, but that doesn't make it okay. Just because this isn't unique to Fox News does not excuse their behavior. I'm sorry, guys. Yeah. So on that note, let's talk just a little bit about where those countries came from, where they came to be. So I'm going to assume we're familiar with basic U.S. history here. First of all, you need to go back and learn U.S. history. Then that's on you.
Are we going to talk about United Fruit? We're getting there, right?
We'll get to that. Actually, we're not even there yet. So first of all, there were 6 countries: Nicaragua, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, being 5 of them, and then actually the Mexican state of Chiapas. Those 6 countries were part of Greater Guatemala, which was a Spanish colony. And it was, without getting into too much detail, it attained its independence around the same time as Mexico. Actually, a little bit later, because this is when Spain was withdrawing itself.
1800s.
Right. Well, 1820s, 1830s, to be more exact. And it was, like I said, it was involved in the Mexican rebellion and like the Mexican independence bid, which was, of course, very messy, and there was multiple sides to it. And also a lot of the Catholic Church was involved, of course. And in this whole shakeup, Chiapas actually joins Mexico permanently, which is one of the reasons Chiapas is so different from the rest of Mexico, because it hasn't been a member. Mexico was all one colony for about 200 years before this even went down, 300 years. So that's kind of something to keep in mind, that once you're in Chiapas, you're already kind of in Central America. The rest of those countries, they spent some time actually trying to live the Bolivarian dream and be one country. So they've alternated between being in all independent countries from each other and actually being one country here and there. Sometimes it was all of them. Sometimes it was 2 or 3. Honduras has actually been one that's taken the lead on multiple occasions to unite all of those countries together. Whereas Guatemala, El Salvador being some of the more heavily indigenous countries, kind of poorer, more rural, they've been more of an independence-bidding country. So I kind of want to point out some of the differences there. So that's kind of the back history. So when we get to the late 19th century, 1870s, 1880s, those countries now, the Spain is long gone, post-Civil War, Mexico's an independent nation. Those countries, particularly the 3 in question, become U.S. colonies for all intents and purposes. Honduras specifically, and Honduras, of course, is of the countries, it's kind of partially Caribbean. Like you said, you don't have the spicy food. It's really more about the banana plantains and whatnot than it is about being more like Guatemala or El Salvador. So Honduras specifically, the term banana republic was actually coined to describe Honduras. Right. This is how badly Honduras was colonized. And there was a time, this lasted probably a good 40, 50 years, where the United States Corporation United Fruit actually ruled as a government about half of Honduras.
It basically rolled up, went, yeah, this is all ours now. We're going to grow bananas here, and you're all our employees, and welcome to the firm.
If only. See, if only it were that. It was worse.
I'm leaving out all the guns and dead bodies,
there wasn't a lot of... That's the thing. It was worse than that. They came in, And first they just, okay, hey, we'd like to build a couple of banana plantations and we'd like to grow some bananas. And hey, it's going to be great for your economy. We're going to pay taxes. And the government, which is extremely corrupt, and it was still, it's kind of still the colonial era, just with Mexico, you have a lot of internal conflict.
In other words, it was for sale, and it was a matter of money, of how much it could take to buy it.
So it started out that way. And then by the time you're getting in the 1900s, literally, they were granted exemptions from all taxes. In Honduras, they were granted exemptions from basically all labor regulations, all laws. That half of Honduras...
Yeah, see, the thing about the regulations, they sort of get in the way of growing bananas in a cost-effective enough way, so...
Right.
We'd like to just not follow them, if that's cool.
Right. So, basically...
Just, here's this giant bag of money, means nothing, but again, like I was saying about those regulations...
Right, so basically, geographically, about half of Honduras, at this point, is controlled by United Fruit. I mean, they can't, kill people, but other than that, pretty much they do whatever they want.
You could work them to death.
Criminal laws. Oh, yeah, there's no workers' comp. Yeah, workers' comp is now we go
he
hire...
didn't die because I shot him. He died because he was working really hard. He's a good worker. Now he's dead.
Now his son has his job.
He
Look, perfect.
Peace, yeah.
And his son has smaller
Good
hands because
Lord.
he's 12, so it's actually easier for him to pick bananas.
Oh, God.
Yeah, this is the kind of stuff that leave the U.S. And again, think of the time frame, early 1900s. You have all these pesky child labor laws getting passed
In
over.
America,
Who came up with this shit, right? So you have this going on, and like I said, you have about half the country geographically controlled by United Fruit, where the government really has no say. More so than that, most of the country's economy is completely dependent on this. Even though they're not paying taxes, they're not paying land taxes or anything. Most people that live in Honduras work for United Fruit. It's way more than half. So they go in there, they live in the barracks because bananas are seasonal. And then they go back to their villages and their cities in Honduras, and that's where they go, and that's where they spend their money. So not only do you have this legal exemption, you have complete 100% economic dependence. And you really didn't have a whole lot of resistance. This is something I want to point out and make very clear, because a lot of militant left will go, oh, yeah, you see, worker and peasant abuse. Bullshit. Because this is still an injection of a huge amount of money. It's just direct injection into the workforce. So a lot of people that worked for this company at the time, they were not educated. They came from very humble roots. So for them, this was a good job with a good paycheck, and they could go back to Honduras and spend that money. And even though it was terrible working conditions, but it was good money. And this, this did contribute to some of their development. But again, a lot of the infrastructure was controlled by United Fruit. Now, one thing we haven't mentioned here that I think is very important with Central America, especially Honduras, is it is very, very prone to hurricanes because of where it is. It's it's that little Central American...
It's Gulf Coast.
Right. You get hit every 20 years or so. There's a massive hurricane that goes through and destroys everything. So I believe this was 1850s or maybe early 1860s. You had Hurricane Fifi. It's a very famous hurricane that came through and basically knocked out the banana plantations. Bananas are very fragile. They're very, very demanding fruit. They're very demanding crop. So it came through and just basically took out probably 60-70% of what United Fruit had built. And United Fruit just figured, they were starting to have a little more problem with resistance, and after 2 or 3 generations, these peasants actually thinking maybe they have rights, they should have a school built.
That's just a road to lack of profitability.
I know. Who taught them this shit, right? So
I don't know what they're reading out there.
Well, where did they learn how to read?
I thought we made
right.
reading
So
illegal.
Right. So all this gets knocked out, and they figure, okay, it's just not worth it to rebuild. So United Fruit literally just picks up and leaves. And if anyone's ever read Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, there's an event in the book where he describes, it's a mystical place, it's a country that doesn't exist, Macondo, but it's talking about how you have all the banana plantations and then they're demanding better rights. There's a peasant uprising after so many decades, and the guy that's in charge, his name is Senor Brown, that's in charge of the plantation, says, okay, it's going to start, I will give you your rights when it stops. It's starting to rain a little bit. And he says, I'll give you your rights when it starts raining. And then the rain lasts 7 years. It's like a biblical flood. And it's just everything gets destroyed. And then when it's done, they're gone. The gringos are gone. Because it's just describing that event. Of course, it wasn't really that long, but...
Right.
So this kind of left Honduras in just plain complete devastation. I mean, one, you have the devastation from the hurricane, which they were not prepared for. There was no infrastructure development for that purpose. Two, all their economy was dependent on these plantations. They hardly even had a domestic economy. So that right there, I mean, that really put Honduras in a very bad place. Now, other places, Guatemala also kind of has a slightly similar history. It's Guatemala and El Salvador, they didn't have quite the corporate control that United Fruit had in Honduras, but you kind of have the same problem. You have governments that are very much in bed with the U.S. corporations and very much allowing the exploitation of their labor and their peasants. And in those countries, because you have a lot of the indigenous, you have that divide. A lot of the government folks are whiter. They speak better English, and they're just basically selling large amounts of land and resources at a very cheap price to U.S. corporations, and then you couldn't even farm the land, even though it was sitting open. And this tends to not endear people to you over generations, where you have your peasants, and your indigenous, and they can't farm the land. So in the 50s, the 60s, where one, you have the guerrilla uprisings, and two, you have the hurricane and kind of United Fruit leaving Honduras, those countries just basically fall into civil war. Because, and I mean, I'm sure we've all recently had the news of Efraim Rios Montt, correct me if I'm pronouncing that wrong, who was former Guatemalan military dictator that the U.S. essentially installed to keep Guatemala under control, basically to keep the guerrilla uprising under control. And this guy just basically created death squads, kind of his own counter guerrillas, and he was convicted by a court, I mean, he's like 80 years old, of genocide, of having killed tens of thousands of indigenous rebels, or not even rebels, tens of thousands of indigenous people that had nothing to do with these guerrilla groups, just in an ethnic cleansing to get rid of the guerrillas. So this is the kind of stuff that what I'm trying to get at here. This is the kind of thing that we've been doing to these countries since the 70s, and that's the 1870s.
Right.
So when we talk about how, it's their problem, it's those countries where they're,
You want a more contemporary example, look up Iran-Contra. Where were the Contras?
Nicaragua. And that was the one country where the guerrilla uprising actually succeeded and became the government of the country for a while. But this very same issue was going on, actually, maybe with possible exception of Honduras. Every one of those countries, Costa Rica, Guatemala, El Salvador, every one of those countries has a very similar history in that sense. So a lot of these gangs, one thing I want to point out is where, you have Fox News constantly complaining about the gangs and constantly complaining about the violence and the smuggling. But a lot of these gangs are layovers from that time. They're either guerrillas that rose up against the U.S. 40, 50 years ago, and these are their children. There's the same organization. Some of them still have the same names. Or they're the death squads that we fed via the military dictatorships in those countries to neutralize the gangs. You see how those are kind of like two rival gangs, and then they just...
We're having to go to war with something. We had some time bomb we set in some other country like Saddam. We had to get rid of him, even though he was useful to us 30 years before. Yeah. Oh, and not to mention the United Fruit had another little dubious event happen, and that was the Fruit Massacre, which was, I think, in the 20s, where they basically shot and killed a couple thousand, maybe was one estimate, strikers. You don't want to work? Okay, bam. I mean, but this was workers' rights in the 20s. I mean, that was true here too. But
stuff like that going on.
This is why, not to mention, and the next time any of our listeners pick up Chiquita bananas, have you ever wondered where that company came from? It used to be known by another name back in the day, United Fruit.
Yes.
Let's keep that one in mind. They changed their name. To sound like they're from the areas that they are. Chiquita. Oh, it sounds kind of Caribbean, doesn't it? And,
I remember eating Chiquita bananas here in the States, and they usually put the name of the country where it came from, whether it was Honduras, Guatemala, and all that. I don't know if you guys remember that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
they just changed their name. That was so horrendous, but yeah,
because just the human rights weight of
point
that.
Being, we've had our say in that country, and we've gone down there to start little fun wars and have all kinds of little toys brought out for people, and to say that we have absolutely nothing to do with what goes on there, it's grossly ignorant at best, and massively obtuse at worst.
Right, the meddling is it's almost unparalleled, the amount of meddling that we've done in South
So the whole
America.
thing, you hear a lot of the right-wingers say things like they assign to the black community. You're like, why can't they just take care of their own people? I don't get it. And it's... I mean, let's leave the condescension of that aside just for a moment, even though, wow, what the hell is the matter with you? You can find people a bad name. It's just, and like we were saying, the Fox News types, don't want to be educated. A lot of them, it seems like they just go la 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 la, anytime a fact tries to enter in. But Fox News, the purveyors of this crap, they rely on the misinformation and flat out uninformation to perpetuate this sort of jingoistic reaction to a real humanitarian problem, which we'll get to that in a minute. Right. You know, it's just massively, it just pisses me off, basically is what it does. I don't even know what to do about it. It just react with just rage because of how wrong it is on a general level. For me, I just react like Rain Man when everything's factually inaccurate and you just keep repeating. I'm like, no.
Right, so the ignorance
that's
on
just
this, right? The ignorance on this is profound. And I kind of want to bring up another topic that's obviously very relevant here. It's a greater topic that I've wanted to talk about on the show for a while, and glad to have Jonathan with us here, and obviously you guys feel free to chime in as well. Basically our own immigration history here. So without getting into a lot of deep history, because I could spend all day talking
we used to hate other white people, too.
Yeah,
anyway, you were saying?
Some of the arguments were very much the
just wanted to point that out, just go down to this level, and then we can build up.
Right, so getting into that, originally, the original U.S. Constitution, basically, we had completely open borders. And we only had them for a few years. We closed them in 1965. That's almost 200 years of open borders. There was no terrorists coming in to blow us up.
Just for anyone who's wondering.
There was no massive terrorist war. We had the open borders the entire time we had the Mexican-American War.
Right.
We were in a war with a country, and we still had open borders. We had them in World War I. We had them in World War II. We had them at least through part of Vietnam. So this idea that if we open the borders, they're going to come in and get us, it is absolutely the loudest bit of horseshit being spread by the community. That's the first thing I want to throw out. Because, let me tell you, okay, of the 19 9/11 hijackers, you know how many came into this country legally?
All of them.
All of them. Thank you, Jonathan.
Right.
Every last one. And 15 of them were still here legally. The other 4 were visa overstayers. So the idea that they're going to get us, that's just complete crap. And anyone that tells you that, I would ask you to challenge them to name one person that's came in and done political harm to this country by crossing the border. Al-Qaeda is too good to cross with the coyotes. It's that simple. They're too smart and have too much money.
Yeah, and not only that, basically, coyotes, I mean, they take advantage of the ignorant people that don't know the routes, how to go by going through Mexico, and they lost a lot of demand from the Mexican immigrants because they know how to just go up and cross.
Right, so the coyotes, those are smuggling cartels, and they're very predatory, and we'll get to that in a minute, Jonathan. Let me kind of cover the history a little bit. So secondly, another thing we did not have happen was this economic catastrophe of they're taking our jobs.
They're taking our jobs.
Yeah, okay, so in the 1830s, 1840s, it was the Irish and the Italians.
Yeah,
and
you should have seen the
Jews.
racist propaganda that came out about your local lazy Irishman. All he does is get up, drink whiskey all day, smack his wife around, pray to God, his Catholic God, by the way, and then go back to bed. That's all he does.
Polish,
no good
Italian,
layabout Irish guy. Yeah, right.
Polish, Italian, Irish. What do they have in common? They're all Catholic.
Italian, those greasy, smelly guys. Those smell like garlic.
Wops, yeah.
Give me a break.
Then,
this has been around.
Right. In the late 19th century, it was the Chinese and the Vietnamese and the Japanese, the Yellow Peril, we called them.
Right.
And that was a lot of that here on the West Coast. And then in the 1920s, and then the early 20th century, it's the Eastern European immigrants running from the communists. Oh, they're the enemy, they're spies, they're it's all the same horseshit. And every time I hear, this is always a last-ditch response from neocons is, well, these immigrants are different. You're making the exact same argument, word for word, and then you're telling me they're different. No, they're not. Shut up. Yeah. You don't know what you're talking about.
Anytime a group started coming in big numbers, right, you had that kind of reaction every time.
Okay. And the other thing is non-assimilation. This is by far my favorite one.
Oh,
what's more American than a sausage pizza?
I heard a radio show, and I was actually on this guy's show, and he's probably the stupidest local radio host I've heard on this town.
And that's saying a lot. That's
this town has Roger Hedgecock in it, just so you know. This guy, his name is Sully, and he does the drive time on Kogo 600. So I was on his show, and I actually asked him a question he couldn't answer, and he cut me off. Anyway,
well, that's what
his literal reason for, and I love listening to local hosts because they take the same outrage of Fox News hosts, but it's like a rudimentary version. It's like scaffolding before a building is built. It's just really bare bones and just not all there. It's the same thing, but just way less evolved. He said, oh, well, back before they used to assimilate, but now, why is it when I go to the ATM I have to pick what language? That proves that they're not assimilating because I have to go to the ATM and I have to say English. I can't just get English. I have to push the button.
That's
wow.
There was a
Where do I even
time-
start with that?
I'll tell you where to start with. Okay, in places like San Francisco
Stupidity
or
like
New
that.
York, you have little enclaves. You have Little Italy. You have Chinatown. Those are not just little museums for you to go look at.
Yeah.
Those are places where, for decades, people lived in an enclave that only spoke their own language.
Right.
And of course, they didn't have ATMs back then. But
First Chinatown, the first little in New York.
right. Well, or on the West Coast in San Francisco,
Yeah.
They did not leave their communities. They were very much segregated. And
they wanted it that way, not to mention at the time, they wanted people, you guys live on that side of town, we don't like that.
It was just normal. We even had, white and black segregation and but the point is, eventually, even those groups assimilated. So based on what Jonathan is telling us here, that you have enclaves of Mexican communities that are both born here and just coming over here. And they're already speaking Spanglish as opposed to just Spanish. And they're talking about assimilating. And they're talking about the importance of learning English and understanding getting ahead. And there's ATMs that are in places where you're going to need both languages. No, what this idiot's telling you, and he doesn't even realize it, is they're actually assimilating faster than they did 100 years ago. And that makes sense with modern technology in the modern world. You just can't stay in your own enclave, no matter how hard you try. Although I'm sure he tries harder than any of them.
That's what's ironic. They accuse that of, and the Glenn Becks of the world want to build their own town called Whiteyville where they all live. And they just talk about how great they are to each other and how, gee, we're all white. Isn't it great that we're all white and there's so many people here? But that's the only reason why they want to do that.
But then Glenn Beck is also the one going and trying to help these kids right now. So I don't want to pick on Glenn Beck too much because Glenn Beck's always been one of the interesting characters, I think.
He's an odd duck. I shouldn't pick on him. He's not as easy.
He's a Mormon, and that really changes.
He's kind of nuts is the thing about him. So he vacillates between two sides.
You tolerate me.
But anyways.
So going back to kind of finishing the history lecture a little bit, because I feel this is very important. So the original Constitution, open borders, anyone could come in that wanted to come in. And there was no birthright citizenship, though. Right. You had to naturalize, and you could naturalize everything. Originally, it was within 2 years, and you had to basically show that you were not a criminal. You had not have been convicted of a crime in that time. That was really the only thing. And
but we didn't have a welfare state, did we?
Well, of course not in the 1700s. We'll get to that. And that should very glad you brought that up, Jonathan. So, and children of immigrants that were born while you're here and you're not a citizen were not citizens, but they could naturalize when their parents did. It's a very important distinction. So then you have, and you had some kind of hysteria laws, in my opinion, in the 19th century where first we had health checks introduced. Ellis Island, Angel Island, a lot of that was about, they're bringing in the disease.
Right.
And by the way, I'm starting to hear that shit again from Fox News, too. Tuberculosis.
I have another rejoinder to that later. I'll add that later on. I'm hearing it from other people besides them is what I mean. But anyway.
I want to point out that this stupidity is just
ages
old. It's nothing new. And when they're, oh God, this crisis. No, it's not a crisis. You're just an idiot.
It was disease first, and then it was quota second.
Right. So the quotas actually came with, you had the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1887. Right. And a lot of other countries got quotas saying, okay, well, we do want immigrants. We're a country of immigrants, but we want to make sure it's not all from one country. It actually wasn't the total immigrants. It was limiting certain countries, and a lot of it was aimed at China. But really, quotas against not against, but just limiting how many come from each country.
Incidentally, we still have quotas anyway.
Yeah, the thing is, quotas are a joke, and especially if you think of 19th century capacity for bureaucracy, how much of a joke they are. If I'm a Polish immigrant and I want to head to the U.S., but I know they're past their quota for that year.
Is there a guy standing there with a clicker?
They ask you where you're from.
Click.
No. They ask you where you're from. So if you think someone, an American in New York in 1885, can tell the difference between a German and a Polish person, you might have to learn a little bit of German, but this is...
Maybe you just ask him his last name, but whatever.
And he lies, because he doesn't have papers. That's what does WAP mean? Without papers. A lot of those countries didn't have the kind of bureaucracies where you'd have papers, and especially in East Asia, in China and Vietnam at the time. So, or you just don't bring your papers because you know that's going to be a problem. You just name whichever country you know is going to get you through, some country they've never heard of. Mm-hmm. This is, when I always talk about this on the show, and I think it's very relevant here, that bureaucracy is always beatable because it's clumsy. And all you have to do is understand it. What you're doing with a bureaucracy, and it goes right back to what you were telling us, Jonathan, is you're discriminating against the poor. You're discriminating against people that can't read. against people that don't have the marginal resources to beat the bureaucracy. If you're someone that's Polish that speaks a little bit of German, you can pretend to be a German. If you come from middle of nowhere in Poland and you hardly even speak or read Polish and you're stupid enough to bring your papers, then you're fucked. You see how that, like, all you're doing is you're discriminating the poor people of that country with quotas versus the rich people of that country. That's all you're doing with it. You're not actually keeping anyone out. Now, going back to our history, of course, post-Civil War, you have the 14th Amendment, which starts birthright citizenship, which in my opinion, and I know that I get a lot of flack for this is the beginning of the end for free immigration. Now, it was necessary at the time, of course, to give citizenship not only to all the freed slaves who were born in the U.S., but also to all the new citizens that were on the land that was formerly Mexico, taken in the Mexican-American War 15 years earlier. So I'm not saying it was a bad idea then. I'm saying they should have let that provision expire, because right now, everyone that's born here, we don't really have that issue with people that are born here. What we do have is people coming over who are, whether they're documented or not, even documented immigrants, and their children are automatically citizens, which becomes a huge boom.
The anchor baby thing,
Well, I don't even want to call them anchor babies. I don't have a problem with immigration. But this is a huge issue because now anyone that basically is born here is a citizen, which in a way attracts people to get over here so they can get citizenship, as opposed to, you want to talk about have them come over here legally. Well, the first thing we need to do is get rid of that and make it way easier to naturalize. We're not even talking about entry. We're talking about naturalization and becoming citizens. Because if you're just citizen by birth, then you're going just opening the door to a whole bunch of bureaucratic problems. And I'm not saying we should just get rid of birthright citizenship. Please don't think that's my proposal. It's as part of a much bigger set of proposals. So you have that, then you have the quotas. And then finally, 1965. 1965, that's later than almost anywhere in Europe.
LBJ again.
Right. Then you have finally the law that says, okay, now you actually need permission. You need a specific visa to cross the United States border, to enter the country. This was, okay, until 1965, we did not have this going on. And thank you, Jonathan, for bringing it up. It was the introduction of the federal welfare state. We had a welfare state back in the 30s with a lot of states. The federal welfare state, and it's the first real handout. So we think of the New Deal, but that's not really a welfare state. Social Security, Medicare, those are earned benefits.
Yeah.
And in the 60s, you have Medicaid and welfare and food stamps. Well, food stamps were a little bit earlier, it was more the 30s, but again, expansion of food stamps. And this is when, the liberals want to pass this, and you have a lot of the more conservative ones saying, well, basically we need a class to exclude. There's never going to be enough for everybody because collectivism does not work. The welfare state's always going to be abused. So we need a class that we can exclude from this. So we're going to raise all this hysteria about how the immigrants are going to come in and get on the welfare state and start abusing the welfare state. So we need to close the borders. That's who we're going to blame in case it doesn't work. And immigrants, and I'm kind of coming up on modern times, immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants, they make a great exclusion class for any kind of welfare state, any kind of collectivism, whether it's left or right, because they're unrepresented. They don't vote. Even if you're a legal immigrant, but you're not a citizen, you don't vote. And if you're undocumented, you kind of have to keep your head down. You can't really organize and unionize. So they make a great way, all the problems that we have as a result of these ridiculous regulations and laws and welfare state and economic policies, you kind of put them on the backs of the immigrants because it's easy. They're kind of an obvious target. They were an obvious target in the 1880s. They're an obvious target now.
They did a Simpsons about that, and I think I played that on this show before.
Oh, anyway. Right. The Bears.
The Bears, yeah.
Right. It's all about the Bears.
Your taxes are high because of illegal immigrants. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So now, obviously, we have closed borders. Now, something, Jonathan, you and I learned in college about migration, but not really Central America because it's far away, like you said, but Mexico, particularly northern Mexico. There have been what's called cultures of migration. Probably, they're documented to like the 1910s, 1920s, but they've probably been going on longer than that, where a lot of the men, working age men, say 16 to 50s, maybe 60s, would every year, every couple of years, they would cross into the United States and they would work seasonal jobs. A lot of them are farm labor jobs. And they would make enough money in a few months here that they could support their family back home in Mexico for a year or two, and then they would go back. And this was, during World War II, we have the Bracero program where we actually legalize this. And we have a migrant worker program. So when we need them, we actually make this legal. We actually encourage this. But this has been going on even when it's not an actual program. It's been going on all the time. And of course, Bracero was more factory workers and farm, but same idea. A lot of it is caused by the farm subsidies passed in the 1930s because the food production in the U.S. is actually so much cheaper than it is in northern Mexico. So then NAFTA in the 80s, early 90s, so all that cheap food floods the markets in northern Mexico. The farmers there cannot support themselves because they can't compete with it. So then they forget their farms and cross over here to work in U.S. farms. And this has been going on peaceably without a problem at least since the 1910s, 1920s. So these guys, we're talking about working age men. They're not expensive. As far as citizens, they work. They don't require a lot. They're not children. They don't go to school. They don't require a lot of health care. And there's accidents. Things happen. But for the most part, they come here, they work, and they go back. They're not becoming huge weights on the welfare state. I'm sure there's exceptions, but quantitatively, generally speaking. So in the 60s, in the 1965, when we closed the borders, and all we did was basically announce that we're closing the borders, that whole class of people said, okay, that's nice. Yeah, I'm going to U.S. to work, honey. I'll see you next year. Yeah, take care of the kids.
Yeah, really.
Nobody cares. Just because you have a law does not mean it's enforceable. We didn't really start enforcing this until the late 80s with Reagan again, because by now, if it's been 20 years, the welfare state's starting to fail. And rather than acknowledge this is failing, we need a scapegoat. So we're going to start the war on drugs for one, because right, it's all those brown people are on drugs. That's why they're on welfare.
They're bringing them over with them, yeah.
Right. And of course. And number two, we need to.
I thought that war on drugs started with Nixon.
Well, some of the original policies, the programs did start with Nixon. Thank you for that. But they
Reagan
really
militarized and
expanded.
ratcheted it way up.
Right.
Yeah.
The amount of spending on it and the amount of
it's kind of like how Kennedy kind of sent the first troops to Vietnam, sort of.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But
Johnson.
really, the war was more like in the late 60s.
Right. Right. So, again, the issue here, well, obviously, one, you're picking a class that you can abuse, and even with minorities on welfare, same idea. They're a lot less likely to stand up to you. But this is kind of where I always talk about how centrism is the worst of both worlds. Okay, you have a failing welfare state. You can't just get rid of it because the left will rise up. So how do we compromise? Oh, okay, we pass a bunch of militarist policies to abuse the poorest and most underrepresented Americans. Awesome. Okay. And that,
take it away.
Exactly. And that kind of brings us to today. So when you're talking about coming over in the 80s, okay, and the culture you're talking about, and I purposely asked you these questions and wanted to hear your experiences with this so people know I'm not just making this up or haven't just read it in a book, is what you're talking about is most of the people here that were from Mexico had been living here and they were born here, because the migrants, you wouldn't even see them. They wouldn't be in that community. They'd be in farm communities, which LA it was not at the time. And you have Central American immigrants, but they are middle-class people that came through with a visa, with the quote and every quota. This is not going on 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. And then as you're a teenager, late 80s, early 90s, what happened was with Reagan's, and then actually with Clinton's policies, with hold the line and all that, is we started building walls and militarizing the border. And these men from Mexico, they had nowhere else to go. This was their livelihood. Some of them have been doing this 20, 30 years. Only now, crossing the border became expensive. You still had to travel, but now it began to pay a coyote, and it became dangerous. So rather than stay in Mexico like the neocons intended, what they did is they started bringing over their families. And
they can't go back, then guess what? They all got to come with me.
This is where your job is.
Yeah,
There's
right.
nothing to do back there. You're not going to starve. You're going to bring your whole family, and you're going to settle down in the United States. And a lot of people, because, for those that are confused, this was Mexico at one point.
Yeah, like Ralphie May always says, they didn't cross the border crossed them.
Right. So
yeah.
A lot of people do have family here. A lot of them do have family. And a lot of these migrants, again, these are not poor migrants, the Mexican migrants. A lot of them are actually middle class. They're working class. They're farmers, but they're middle class farmers. So, and they have their farms back home. A lot of them, they came over here to make extra money to support their own farms back home. So they have money, they have family in the U.S., so they would come and they'd cross over and they would bring their children. So when you're talking about this influx of new migrants in the 90s, which you experienced late 80s, early 90s, that's what you're talking about. There is your evidence, people. This is what happened, and you have this extreme expansion in undocumented immigration and people permanently staying. And now it is the people that these policies were aimed to keep out. It is small children. It is women. It is the elderly, people who do become drains on the welfare state. Well, our own border policy caused this. That's what no neocon wants to admit. Yes, this is, I mean, okay, you could say this is a problem. They're coming over and they're not really carrying their weight. Although, personally, if you're mooching off the welfare state, I really don't care if you have papers. I don't see how that, not costing me anymore. There's plenty of legal Americans that mooch off the welfare state their entire lives.
There are studies that poke holes in the fact that they're all a drain, but that's a different argument.
Well,
but I guess I wondered if we wanted to pivot to the specific thing that's going on right now with the children coming over.
And I think we're ready to do that now. I kind of wanted to set all this up.
So here's the question then. Are they immigrants or are they refugees? As that seems to be a very big point of contention, let's say, on a couple different sides of things.
And let's talk about that. What constitutes a refugee?
Typically, the most egregious examples are if you have, let's say what's going on in Syria, what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on in Israel or Gaza or whatever. There's a war, people literally dying left and right.
Okay.
If you stay, you're going to die, so you're just leaving. Just because, or like Rwanda genocide, any of those.
Okay. So according to the Department of State, here in the U.S., or the UN, some of their definitions, you have to be displaced either by war,
right,
by violence, it would be like actual war, insurgent violence counts, or you have to be displaced by discrimination of some sort. Discrimination, basically unfair treatment where you're seeking political asylum. It can be ethnic, it can be religious, like the Darfurian genocide, whatever it might be. So typically, shitty economic conditions where you're coming from do not constitute refugee status. Just by legally, I'm not saying that shouldn't be the case. I'm just saying if it's just because they're poor and there's no opportunities, then
I thought it was worse than that. I thought it was, and I admittedly have to look into this more deeply to find if this is true, but what's being said is there's violence, there's people dying, and if they stay, they're going to get killed.
Now, what do you think of that, Jonathan? What can you tell us about that with Central America?
Well, I don't know if you remember yesterday Obama and the three presidents got together from Central America, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras.
In L.A., actually, I think.
Oh, yeah? Is that where they...
It was, yeah. Yeah, he was in L.A. He did a fundraiser, too. Got to love Obama. Never misses a fundraiser.
Oh, yeah, of course.
But he also found time after raising money, he found time to deal with the affairs of state.
Okay.
But yeah, no, I heard of that. Sorry, go on.
So basically, the argument that the Honduran president is making, and that kind of makes a lot of sense to me, is that it's the negative spillover effect of the policy on the war on drugs. Basically, the United States was working with Colombia for a while. I don't know when this started, but they were working to get rid of that, eliminate the drugs. The production
cartels
over there.
Okay.
And so cartels, they're like, oh, where can we go then? Let's just go to Central America. Those are pretty weak countries, and we could do whatever we want over there.
Because we just do such a great job of eliminating the things that we say we're going to eliminate as a country, don't we? We made drugs illegal, and boy, you can't find a drug in this country. You just can't.
Yeah,
and I don't know if, and also United States working with Mexico and trying to eliminate the same thing. And then all those people, the cartels, they're like, let's just go to Central America. We could get away with all that over there.
Okay.
So kids, the poor kids, they're basically, oh man, they're willing to do anything just to live there because there's just too much crime.
Okay. Right. So let us not forget our own piece of involvement in that little problem,
Right. Well, again, so
we nominally fight it, but yet it's our demand for drugs that causes the issue in the first place. So,
right. So what you're saying is, it's the war on drugs. I mean, obviously, kind of the north end of South America, Colombia, Ecuador, those are the countries that produce the drugs. Mexico is a big smuggling station because that's how you get them into the U.S. And there's some production as well. So you're saying that kind of the war on drugs in those two places, kind of spilling into Central America, which is in between. That's what you're saying, Jonathan.
Yes.
And of course, there's plenty of thugs for hire because we have all these leftover gangs and communist guerrillas. And if
we put them in business, yeah.
Right.
If you notice, they don't move to Panama or Costa Rica because those countries the governments have more control of everything. The businesses have more control of everything. And on the poorer countries like Honduras or Guatemala, there's not that much control when it comes to that. So there's more open room for corruption and also for controlling and starting new businesses there.
So you mean when you have infrastructure development and you have a government that's actually responsive to people and it's elected and it's accountable, you're going to have less corruption, you're going to have less gangs running around, and you're going to have basically less organized crime running the show. That's what you're saying, John.
Exactly.
Right? It's amazing how that works. So,
Concept.
again, if you think about even Costa Rica or Panama, the amount of U.S. meddling and the amount of U.S. just basically starting death squads and fighting proxy wars in those countries, or even in Colombia, versus Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. I'd throw Nicaragua on there too. There's your difference. And even Chiapas versus northern Mexico. That distinction is very important. So what you're saying is it's bottlenecking there, literally. And also, I think something you didn't mention, Jonathan, that I think is important. If you're going to carry your drugs from Colombia or Ecuador to Mexico, you kind of have to go through Honduras or Guatemala. They're kind of
the thing about that, yeah.
Inconvenient countries that are in the way.
Why would you take a boat and go across the water and just walk? I mean,
right. Now, here's another thing. If you have a whole couple of decades, 70s, 80s, depending on which country you're in, where it was just pure insurgent wars going on for decades. We have the U.S.-funded death squads versus the guerrillas, and I don't take a side. They're both murderers. It's like in Iraq or in Syria. You really can't take a side there, right? And you have just mass genocide and these gangs. The people involved in this, a lot of them, and they had children that were born in in this. They have nowhere to go. So now that the U.S., in the last 20 years is more or less pulled out of there, now we're getting back in, but we were not involved for a while, you basically created a bunch of thugs that don't know how to do anything but kill, and then you left them there. And now here comes the Colombian drug cartel. Hey, you guys. Hey, look, I got money. I got la cocaína. Well, really,
So the refugees.
Right. So you would say, Joe, by your definition, that they qualify as refugees. It's just, again, it's difficult for me to make that as a blanket statement. I'm sure a lot of them are.
Yeah.
Depends where they're coming from, what parts of those countries. I would say probably Guatemala and El Salvador more so than Honduras, based on what Jonathan is telling us.
I was dovetailing into a criticism, if I may. This is directed toward the mayor of one city called Murrieta, California.
Oh, Lord.
And Mr. Adam Long.
By the way, it's about 20 miles from 40 miles from where we are, so it's very
one county
very
over in the beautiful, gorgeous county of Riverside. You say that word, Riverside County.
Heard that good pollution.
Riverside. You gotta love it.
My lungs kind of catch fire when I hear that word.
I would like to address the specific gripes, complaints, raised by the protesters outside of the ICE facility there, as a bunch of refugee children rolled up in a bus that they stopped and then turned around, and they were feeling very satisfied with themselves. And a bunch of unemployed soccer moms standing out with posters going, "Not our children, not our problem." This is a country of, won't anyone think of the children? But it depends on what color they are, I guess.
Living in the United States, what I've noticed, living in the United States, is basically you have I don't know what the statistics is exactly, but it just seems to me like there's at least 85% of a lot of ignorant white people in the United States.
Well, it's kind of a problem, but anyway, and they were saying the things like I was saying, oh, they have scabies and they have weird diseases. It's like, wow.
Welcome back to 1885.
So I'd like to congratulate all of you for having your voices heard and standing up and declaring your own voice and being your own people and being so obedient to the mayor at the same time of doing what he told you to do. And I just wanted to ask you a question. Did you not realize that basically you were puppets, extras, if you will, in the little pantomime game that the Fox News types are running, and that you were just useful idiots that they then ran coast to coast on all their news programs that night? And I use the word news,
very generously,
sarcastically. The idea that they're so afraid that a bunch of brown people are going to start spilling over the border and wanting to live in their manicured lawn, hot valley, freaking suburban cookie cutter house hellhole. That's the magnet for all of Central and Latin America. They're so worried that they're going to go to their favorite wine and pizza shop and they're going to have chimichangas there or something. I mean, it's just, what are you even afraid of?
It's like, hey, assholes, by the way, none of these people came to Murrieta. Did you notice there was no migration to Murrieta? That's where ICE
They were being driven there on a bus
by the government. Yes.
They were in custody. They're not walking around. They're not going to the grocery store going, dos cervezas, por favor. They're not doing any of that. What is your problem?
10-year-olds were going dos cervezas, I'd be a little concerned. But here's the thing.
It's like, do they even know what they're angry about?
They don't. But that's the thing. Remember we said earlier in the show about abuse of the most non-represented, unresponsive, defenseless people to deal with a problem. And of course, using racism for that. What's easier than racism?
Well, there's a lot of fear-mongering going on.
Yes.
Especially like violence. Like, oh, look at these kids. They're only 12 years old and they're out there and raping and killing people. And you can't put them accountable for it because there's no way to track them either, you know?
Yeah, there's
statistics, please.
Yeah, there's this term out there called representativeness. And a lot of the shit I've seen, it's mind-bogglingly stupid. And I get out there and I start getting brutal in response to it because I see someone post photographs like, oh, this is what's going on. And you have prostitutes. I'm like, look at the buildings. That is not in the U.S. Okay? And you have these guys like out in the middle of the jungle and you have like Guatemalan gangs that are all just tatted from head to toe. I'm like, that's in a Guatemalan prison. I don't care. They're not here. They're in a Guatemalan prison where they belong. Why are we...
It's the same kind of terrorism, scary thing that we get. Yeah.
Yes. But then, let's make this a little more political. This is basically conservatives, from their perspective, having no solution to this problem. The Republican Party having no solution to this problem. Being unable to address it, being unable to actually offer a proposal that fixes this issue. So they turn it into racist fear-mongering. Like I said, one solution, one thing that I've always advocated for, I'm going to continue advocating for, is we need to get rid of the federal welfare state. That's the one legitimate argument for conservatives why people coming over and undocumented are a problem. You get rid of the welfare state and you open the borders. And a conservative that thinks like that is called a libertarian.
That's not possible, but anyway.
A lot of neocons, hold on, a lot of neocons are not satisfied with that idea. One, because they're driven by racism and xenophobia. Two, because they're not prepared to go that far with the welfare state, whether or not you agree with it. So instead, it's let's blame the brown people. And this is where it's coming from. And of course, you're going to abuse the most ignorant people you can find to enforce this for you. You can't have the politicians out there telling them not to bring these children to have scabies. So let's use ignorant soccer moms in Murrieta.
I think, so obviously I have a different opinion. I don't think getting rid of the quote-unquote welfare state is realistic because...
Federal. Not all the welfare state. Federal.
There's still people with needs. Let's just say I don't support taking that off the table. But the question that I asked to the idiot radio show host in our town was, look, you people, meaning conservative neocon idiots, like to always go, they're all, count them up. Each one of them, well, he was literally counting numbers. He was like, each one's going to cost you $20,000 a piece, and X this many per year, please. X this many per blah. Oh my God, it's going to cost $18 trillion. You know, it's like, so I'm like, so you sit there and you add these things up as if not one of them will ever be a productive tax-paying citizen in this country. A, that's just straight up false. You can't say that. You don't know, for one. For two, isn't there anything we can do to change that? And I said, isn't it a good thing that, A, it's a place people want to come, A? Well, didn't we used to aspire to that? To be the shining city on the hill? I used a Republican's term. You see how I used
awesome.
I used Reagan against him. Isn't that great? You like that one? Took Reagan and I pointed it at him. Yeah, you love that.
But anyway. That was talking about white people.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
You
right.
couldn't say that, right?
So, and I'm like, but if you take a little bit of money now, and obviously we disagree on that part, but if you treat it like an investment, you educate them, you make them productive job-holding citizens. Isn't that a good thing? Aren't we growing the pie of this economy instead of this idea of they're just sitting there on the dole endlessly? If you're othering them, aren't you forcing them to do that?
Right. You are not only forcing them into that, you're forcing them into crime.
Right. And you say they're criminals even though, well, how is they going to make money?
Right. But here's the thing. Here's the other
They're here. It's kind of like the one on Antonio Vargas when he says, what are you going to do with us? We're here. were here already.
Yeah, they're not going anywhere.
I was 10 years. The guy, you know what I'm talking about, right? The guy, the Filipino activist.
I know what you're talking about. Yes,
he was just arrested actually in Texas. Where else? Texas. For covering this story. Actually, he was down there for CNN. But he's like, "What are you going to do with us? I was sent over here when I was 10 years old on a plane. I came here like I was on a trip. I didn't know it was illegal. What are you going to do with us now that we're here? We were educated in your schools. We grew up in your country. We love this place as much as you do. What are you going to do with us now that we're here?"
Let's get in. I want to get into that, but first let's try some numbers. So actually, Joe, to answer what you're saying, most illegal or undocumented immigrants are tax-paying productive citizens. You know, another thing that neocons love to use to scaremonger is they want to point out the guys hanging out in front of Home Depot looking for day labor. But if you look at the numbers, the number of undocumented here, there's just plain not enough Home Depots for that to be represented. That's just crap.
You wouldn't be able to park in the Home Depot for people standing in front of it.
Right,
Yeah.
those are the guys that are here probably for their first time. They're probably from southern Mexico, from the shit parts of Mexico. They don't speak any English, so they're the ones. They're the poor of the undocumented. Most
they don't even speak Spanish.
Right, a lot of them are
them, yeah.
indigenous, and they don't speak very good Spanish anyway. They come over here. Most undocumented come over here. They have jobs that they take. I have to point this out. You can buy false documents. Just because you make something document, just because you make a law, just like that border was closed for 20 years before anybody cared, that does not mean you're actually closing that door. They buy false social security numbers, and they use these. And there's employers, sometimes they're lying to the employer, sometimes the employer is in bed with them, can be one or the other. But
Social security fraud's hard. A lot of them I was reading, there was one from Colombia I was reading about. He bought a Mexican driver's license because those are really easy to fake.
Oh yeah, in Mexico you get
And so-
you get
and the
any
idea
document
being-
you want for $50.
Well, the idea being, think about it. You're Colombian. If you're busted, they send you back to where you come from, right? But if you're holding a Mexican driver's license, guess what? That trip back is a lot shorter.
Yeah, and you even got a driver's license for when you drive across. Yeah, so
Yeah, that's been happening for a long time.
it's been going on since the 80s. So you get false papers, and you're working, and guess what? If you have a social security number, even a fake one that you're using, you're having taxes withheld. And a lot of immigrants south of the border have larger families, so they would actually be getting a pretty large tax return, except they never file their tax returns because then you'll get busted because your social security number is fake.
Yeah.
So they're actually overpaying their taxes a lot. Now,
Exactly.
Again, you can talk about how, a lot of them are poorer than the
And
average
a lot of them are
American.
sending their money home and all that.
There's remittances, yes, but we do that. My family did that for years when we came over. That's not an undocumented immigrant problem. That's an immigrant problem if you're going to turn that into a problem. So really, a lot of this just cherry-picked information to scaremonger. But something I want to touch on, and this is, I don't know how Joe will react to this, is kind of how the Democratic Party has handled this particular equation. So first of all, something that I've been hearing a lot in Fox News and the conservative media, and there's a morsel of truth to this, is that this crisis, this wave of children coming across, has been in response to Obama saying, firstly, his executive order that now when we deport someone and we repatriate, like you said, we have to repatriate them to their country of origin, as opposed to just throwing them back into Mexico. Now, throwing people back into Mexico is absolutely the biggest, most ridiculous waste of resources because they're just back the next day. I mean, if you're going to have policies have to be effective. When I was in school and we learned about this, and Jonathan, you were there with me, we learned about how most people, the majority of people crossing the southern border, are apprehended at least once. And this is 10 years ago. Our information's a little dated. And then to the point that most coyotes had gotten to where they would actually, for the price, you'd get two tries or 3 tries. Okay, they throw you back, they put you back on a truck and they cross you again. Well, it's not 2 for 1. It's, because that's how much it takes to get across. These guys are businessmen. So they know that you have to, if you're going to get caught once, you can try twice. You can try a second time. And I believe that the statistic we learned in school was 96% of those who attempt get across. That's not, considering how much money we're spending on border enforcement, that's beyond embarrassing. I mean, for the other 4%, it could be anything. Their mother could have died back home and they decide they're going to turn around and go back. That's not even, that's
embarrassing for that agency, isn't it?
It's embarrassing for the U.S. government. Like, really, we're spending this much money. Now, so what we've done since 9/11 in the last 10 years, in the last 15 years, is we've militarized the border. And one thing we've started doing is we've started putting people in detention centers as opposed to just deporting them or as opposed to just catching them and letting them go. And this has become a huge problem. Actually, a lot of this has happened under Obama, not under Bush. This has become a huge problem because these detention centers are so overwhelmed. We were never intended to hold this many people. We either catch them and repatriate them, or they get through. You want to talk about becoming a drain on public resources. You put all these people in jail that haven't really done anything.
And who are productive members of society on the other side. Yeah,
yes,
right.
Yes, now, I'm not really sure what the story is.
You're jailed for the crime of wanting to be here and work here and earn a living. Okay.
Or if they're children, how expensive is it to hold children in detention? You want to think about that.
Right.
Now, with Obama, he's been trying to get his immigration reform passed for a while. I mean, there was the DREAM Act, and that died. And you have
at the same time, by the way, it's kind of the same kind of double-faced opinion. He's been deporting like shit tons of people, even though they keep saying he doesn't.
Right. And here's the thing about that. Let's talk about this immigration reform. Now, I know that a lot of people, both on the right and the left, are very frustrated with the government, with the deadlock about how, this immigration reform would be so great, but they're just too busy fighting each other. It's the far right. It's far like no. I'm glad that immigration reform is not going anywhere because, in my opinion, it's absolutely the worst of both worlds. The neocons want billions and billions of more dollars toward policies of putting up walls and detaining people.
Yeah, that's in the law.
Don't work.
Right.
Not only that, but there's all kinds of elements of e-verify, and that's the rising police state. I do not need the federal government knowing where I work. You understand? This is now you're talking about documenting everybody's workplace. I lived in a country that did that. It was called the USSR. You're on your way to a national ID at that point. Okay, so
which they already kind of want anyway.
Right. But, so again, trying to establish a police state to make this work. On the other hand, with the left, they want amnesty for all the people that have been here for so many years, and I can't say I disagree with that because they're here anyway. We might as well legalize.
What are we going to do with them? Yeah.
But since we're not opening the borders. What you're doing is you're militarizing the border. At the same time, this is the second time Reagan did the first round of amnesty. Now you're going to attract more and more and more. You cannot have amnesty without open borders. So when you hear conservatives talk about how Obama invited this, in a sense, there's an element of truth to that. And not only that, but he has executive orders mentioning, so children that came over, like the Filipino gentleman that you're talking about, they're going to have amnesty, and we're going to repatriate you to the country that you came from. A lot of that was just done to spite Republicans for not wanting to pass immigration reform. But this, I'm not saying intentionally, but the unintended consequence is this so-called refugee crisis, because now a lot of families in Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras are sending children, and a lot of them are sending their children, what people don't realize is to join other family members or friends that they have here because they want them out of there. And they've heard, a lot of times this is not entirely accurate because they hear it from the gangs that are facilitating the transfer, and those are not the most honest businessmen out there.
People who smuggle things in Mexico, they smuggle people and drugs pretty interchangeably, so it's those people you're dealing with.
They might stuff you in a plastic bag,
right?
Like a few tons of marijuana, and that's how your child's getting transported to the U.S. So in any case, they get here, these children, a lot of times they have someone that they're walking with or they're walking in groups. So you can see how, between the fact that they have to repatriate them to those countries, which is not easy, it's not just throwing them into Mexico, and between the fact that, they want to come here and join their families because they expect to be amnestied because they came over as children, even though that's only retroactive. It does not work for people that came after the executive order, but they don't know that. In a sense, Obama's kind of executive belligerence and trying to go over the legislative branch's head, it has contributed to this. And not only that, but you can't deny that it was his party that closed the borders with LBJ.
Another thing is, you could say that the one thing is the backlog is that the children usually, if they ask to stay, they get a hearing. Problem is, the hearing takes a year and a half to happen.
And a lot of them don't even show up. That's the other thing.
And then it's like, you promised to be here in 2 years, right? Oh, sure, yeah. See you later.
Por supuesto.
I'll be there. there. Yeah.
You won't recognize me, though, because I will have aged 2 years and I'm 10. Jeez. But yeah,
it's like, what do you do with? And they just go find their family, and then they're just here.
They do exactly what they were planning to do in the first place, which begs the question.
Because a lot of the gangs that bring them over tell kids, just go and surrender yourself.
Well, it's cheaper
because then it's quicker. You get processed. You'll get a meal while you're getting processed.
Well, no. What that is the Mexican drug cartel doesn't want to have to feed them and clothe them until they get them halfway across the country. They prefer I do it via the immigration detention center.
You'll get checked over by medical staff. Yeah, exactly.
So my and I know we've done a lot to work up to this point. My point is, this is kind of a typical point that I have. The reason it's the perfect storm. These laws are completely unenforceable. The border is not controllable. No country in history has ever managed to close its borders to entry. To exit, yes, like the USSR. Not to entry. It's
Just
not
ask
happening.
Israel.
Yeah.
We'll get to that in a later show.
A different show. Or Ukraine,
we will
Russia.
acknowledge
or
it,
Ukraine and Russia right now. What's going on there?
just ask them.
Right. It is not happening. Theoretically, maybe it's possible. But feasibility-wise, the amount of money and resources that would take, it's not ever going to occur. And as you can see, the propaganda has been pushing for this for over 200 years, and we're no closer to doing it now than we were then. So if that's what you're saying, you're just plain ignorant. And I don't want to hear it. There's really no, it's not your perspective. You're just plain wrong. Your argument is not based on facts and empiricism.
Just ask the Chinese, by the way. This is not a new idea.
Yeah, building walls.
They're like, we've done it.
I wonder how much money it cost West Germany and East Germany back in the Cold War to have that
like Checkpoint Charlie and Berlin Wall.
A little tiny wall
in
and
Berlin,
still, it
right?
didn't
Just
really,
one
it
city.
really didn't work.
And even then, right?
It didn't work then. Now, going back, but again, that was an in wall, not an out wall. The West wasn't trying to keep them out. The East was trying to keep them in. That's very different. Mm-hmm. And even that didn't work all that well. Now, secondly, what this so-called crisis is just decades, if not centuries, of bad policies coming back to bite us in the ass. Okay, our meddling in Central America, growing up gangs and death squads. Okay, that tends to come back and bite you in the ass because you destroy the economies of those countries, and then the people turn into refugees. And where do they come? Here. Our drug policies in the last 30, 40 years with Colombia, with Mexico, okay, that's what's spilling over and causing the problems there in many ways. Our immigration policies closing the borders to where we have such a huge undocumented population that now we have to think about amnesty. Now we have to think about things like E-Verify. Now we have to change our repatriation policies and our detention policies. And finally, all of this comes back and bubbles in to tens of thousands of children that we literally cannot support. And what I read, the last number I read was in the next year, we are expecting 200,000 more. We do not have the resources to support 200,000 children in detention. Further, no one's going to give those agencies that money. It's not happening, not with this deadlocked Congress, which makes me happy. So what I'm seeing is I'm seeing both parties, and we've seen this with a few issues, but I think this one is not going away. We're seeing both parties just hopelessly attack each other and hopelessly desperately try to make Americans blame the other party for this problem. Because the reality is, it is both of your faults. It is the fault of your shit compromises starting in the 1870s and going all the way through the 1980s and the 1990s and today. You put all this together and now it's time to pay the fiddler. And if you look at elections, if you don't think this is something that's going to become reflected in our national politics and in elections, if you don't think Americans are paying attention, I would have pointed you to two elections that have happened very recently. One was Republican Majority Leader Eric Cantor getting thrown out by a no-name. And that person, even though I like him on a lot of issues, Dave Bratt, his number one thing that he beat Cantor on was saying no amnesty, no amnesty, no amnesty, no amnesty, no amnesty, whereas Cantor, not a fan of Cantor, but he was actually trying to promote this immigration reform. He was kind of the lead Republican on that. And that got him thrown out. That's how powerful the fringes are becoming. That's how sick everyone is of this. The other one is the Georgia Senate primary runoff, Republican Senate primary runoff, to fill the open seat being vacated by Saxby Chambliss, who's retiring. And that was the two guys. I'm not a fan of either of them, but it came down to the wire. And again, the guy that won is an outsider, is not a real politician. And again, he kept hammering the insider guy, the guy that's a congressman, on amnesty, immigration. This is everywhere, and it's radicalizing both sides on the left. It's people that want amnesty. It's people that are going. It's politicians that are more pro-immigration that are going to be winning elections. That are going to be winning basically minority support, which is very important in the Democratic Party. So this is the poison pill for both parties. I feel more than any other issue.
I think that. Obviously, ignorance is a problem. I've already demonstrated just a few examples. But I think the biggest thing is, when I hear immigration reform, I don't I don't think the thing that they're referencing when they're talking about it now, that bill, that monster, which is really Obamacare for immigrants, let's just say.
that too.
The worst, everyone's horrible idea, yeah, I can make it shittier, just all written down on one piece of paper. When I hear immigration reform, I hear things like, I don't know if you ever watched the John Oliver show. He's talking about his own experience. This is a guy who has money, who is, well-educated, very articulate dude, came over for a TV show. He's very much in the media spotlight, every week. He had to go jump through all these hoops, and it's like he had the resources to hire a lawyer to go, fill out all these papers just to become naturalized. It's a freaking, and I know you would say it's not possible to fix that, but isn't it incumbent upon America to, when you tell people you have to go, so you have to wait in line. Do people, when you say that, have any clue how long that line is? How horrendously it's managed? How many hoops and just trap doors and just secret things you can just run into that, denied, gotta go back to the end of the line again. It's not so simple as that. So I think in closing, I'm, of course, as usual, I'm Toxin's all about the policy. I'm all about the methodology, maybe, or the thought processes.
Organization.
Which is funny because I thought you were the organizer. Anyway, I think that everyone needs to step out of their own little bubble and actually research these things and look into what's involved in doing the thing you insist all these people do for the privilege of standing next to you in line at Starbucks. God forbid they do that if they're from somewhere else. Don't rely on jingoism, rely on facts. Okay? Let's not get sucked into an ideology game.
I definitely agree that, this is something that before we can hope to do anything about it, people have to really understand this issue, the history behind it. It's a very multifaceted issue.
It's not simplistic,
on, right?
No.
And one thing I would say, the way you fix this, you really have to simplify the bureaucracy. I mean, ideologically speaking, the government makes a piss poor choice for who decides who gets to be here and who doesn't. And think about that. Conservatives, you're supposed to not trust government, yet somehow...
Yet they insist on having them orchestrate this process. And it's a clusterfuck.
And they let in all 19 9/11 hijackers. Every last one of them got a visa. It's not working. Yeah. There is absolutely one of the reasons I'm so radical about eliminating these policies and eliminating these agencies, because they are bringing zero benefit. There's zero reason to believe they're doing anything for America. It's pure speculation, and the evidence of their failure is all around us.
And it's interesting what you said about Toxin, about the how terrorists, they were all legal from 9/11. And basically, there's a lot of people that are here legally that, in reality, they don't even want to be here. They hate America and they hate American culture. And all these kids that are coming in from Central America, I'm pretty sure a lot of them, maybe not all of them, but a lot of them, they want to prove that they want to be productive citizens to the United States.
Right. So that whole idea, you have citizens who barely give a shit and maybe don't even exercise their civic abilities, privileges half the time. Yet they want, these guys to be. They don't even give them the chance, and yet at the same time they're trying to be more American than the Americans just to fit in. So yeah, it's on both sides. It's just everyone's going past each other, and I believe it's incumbent upon us to keep that in mind. It's they're wanting to be. I think the mistake is everyone describes horrible motives to what people want to be here. They just want to come here to suck off the welfare state. They just want to come here to commit crimes or smuggle things. Or
well, if they want to do that, they could do that back home. Just
to me, it just smacks of arrogance, honestly, if you want to get down to it, because it's of course, that's the only reason, right? It's not. It amazes me that people who profess to be so pro-America don't think of that as an explanation. Again, why is that a bad thing?
How many legal Americans sit there and mooch off the welfare state for decades? Why is this? Why
it's
are
just
we
a really limp argument.
The immigrants,
because the welfare system creates incentives, and people take advantage of the incentives. People's their behavior choices are on incentives.
And where I'm going to agree with both of you, I'm going to agree with Joe here, is that even though, the welfare state has problems, it has freeloading problems, it has mooching problems, it has incentive problems, like you said, Jonathan, and this is, we're going to disagree on how to fix those problems. Where we're not going to disagree is that's a welfare state problem, not an immigration problem. And we should not be blaming immigration and marginalizing immigration for that, because we're making that problem, immigration problem, worse with the welfare state problem. So I do think we need to wrap up. It's kind of been a longer show. So we thank you for being with us, Jonathan.
You're welcome.
We'll
Thank
definitely be bringing this up a lot more in later shows. I think this is an issue that I don't think a lot of people have caught on just how deep this runs and just how long this storm is going to stay. It's not going anywhere. It's going to get worse. It's going to be very bad for both party establishments. And if you don't believe me, just watch. Watch my prediction come true.
I guess we'll see, especially now that the National Guard is down by the Texas border. Gotta love Perry, don't you?
And again,
Anyway.
if that's where if they're in Texas, they're just going to cross in Arizona. That doesn't work.
I know, that's the first thing I saw. It's like, well,
Arizona.
Arizona, New Mexico, here they come, right? And
now
here, too, for that matter.
Well, here
Yeah.
it's a little different.
Here it's
Yes.
harder. Anyway.
The walls, at least here, and out in Imperial County, not an issue.
And of course, Obama just can't stand to be spited, and now he's trying to go show about whatever. It's all a show.
That's what I'm
people.
saying. You have the Perrys versus
all
the
a
Obamas.
show.
Yeah, they all got to go. There's no right. There
None
are no
of them
good
are interested
guys.
in problem solving. They just want their big dick out there for everyone to see, and to have the biggest dick around, and all this stuff. And yeah. So.
Well, the cool thing about technology now these days, also though, it's that we have now we eliminate all that. It takes less now for people to become aware of what the truth as opposed to before.
True, information is better.
Information
of course, so does
definitely
misinformation, but
yes,
both
but
ways.
I would say that definitely there's a net benefit there.
All right.
So I'm Neurotoxin, and we'll see you all next time if it's still going on. Although Joe and I kind of have a disagreement about whether or not it will be. We'll definitely be talking about some of the more global crises in Ukraine and Israel and how those connect. And I know we've touched on that a lot, but I think it's time to go back to that, and I think it's relevant. If not, then we'll have something else for you. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Jonathan. I'm
All right.
Neurotoxin.
And I'm Joe Ryan, and keep an eye on our Facebook page for more about Israel, too. Thanks for listening. Thank you for listening to The Edge of Chaos. We can be found on the internet at edgeofchaospodcast.com. That's edgeofchaospodcast.com. Contact the show, edgeofchaospodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter at edgeofchaosshow. We can also be found on Facebook at facebook.com/The Edge of Chaos. Neurotoxin's blog can be found at neurotoxins with an S, FYG, at blogspot.com. My blog can be found at joeryansworld.blogspot.com. For Neurotoxin, this is Joe Ryan. Thank you for listening to The Edge of Chaos.
We find ourselves, folks, in the middle of a war we can't afford financially. I won't address any other aspects of the war this evening, but it is time to refit the biggest army the world has ever seen. And here's the problem. We're broke. We ain't got no money. We're still writing checks like you do in real life. Just praying to God somebody will cash one of these useless son of a bitches, you know. You're $17 trillion in debt. You still got a checkbook, really? Seems like somebody eventually is going to take that checkbook away, you know. And you know what? China's cashing our checks, and that's not a good plan for this country, mark my word. And they can't figure out a way to fund this war. And I came up with a great idea that nobody will listen to. Well, you're about to because of your proximity to this speaker system. I was just down in Cocoa Beach, Florida, and just south of Cocoa Beach, Florida, is a huge Air Force base that takes up 115,000 acres of oceanfront property. They have military housing on the beach. Major Nelson didn't have oceanfront property, and he was an astronaut with a motherfucking genie. If you gotta have oceanfront, join the Navy, that's all I'm saying. And back that base up 15 miles and let us sell this asset to help pay for this war effort. We can sell it to Israel. They've got a lot of cash. They need a place to stay. That shit ain't working out for them over there. And it's the only part of Florida they don't already own. And we take the money we make from selling the rest of Florida to Israel. We buy Mexico, fix it up, and flip it. Now, we'll have to send down some painters and landscapers because they're all up here. And when they're gone, you're going to wonder where the fuck they went. You ain't going to want to do this shit yourself. Not if you're anything like me. We sell Mexico to a country that can put a ton of cash down, but you know they can't make the payments. Like Peru. Peru has billions and billions of U.S. dollars. They do. In cash, in banks, all over Peru. It's our cocaine money they tricked us out of. I mean, it's your cocaine money they tricked you out of. We get all that money back, billions of dollars, and then we finance the balance of Mexico to Peru. All right, we let them get behind on the payments. We repossess Mexico. Now we have Mexico free and clear. New paint, new shrubs. And with all that cocaine money, we start buying countries south of Mexico. We buy them all. We buy Belize, Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Costa Rica. And every time you buy one of those countries, that long-ass wall this country needs to build gets a little fucking shorter, doesn't it? Until eventually we buy back the Panama Canal, which we built anyway, stand there and go, swim this, bitch.